Share that. There we go. Okay. We'll start from the beginning. All right, the title of my exhibit was The U.S. Navy Mass Flight of January 1937. It was an interesting flight that took place, and there's some historical tidbits that I'll point out as we go through this. Not a lot, but just one or two that make it kind of interesting. It was a single frame exhibit that I put together on this, and it is in fact my first exhibit that I've ever done. So bear with me on that too. In April of 2012, I was up at the what used to be called the Moses Lake Annual Philatelic Day event, and it's now called, I believe, the John Arn Commemorative Philatelic Day event. And there was an item that showed up, a lot of covers that showed up in the silent auction. It consisted of 206 airmail first flight and other types of event covers. All of it was airmail. And I saw this cover in the lot, and I couldn't, because I found this cover in the lot, I couldn't resist picking it up. It's a number 10 stamped envelope, and it just appeared really interesting to me. So that's kind of where this started. If you notice, there appeared to be 5 different events documented on the cover, along with an event cachet in the center lower portion of the cover. One other thing that I would like you to note, because it'll come to bear later on in my presentation, is this little circled number 3 in the bottom left-hand corner of the front of the cover. So I started investigating this thing. It's a common Scott U-525 2-cent Carmen die 1. But the 5 events recognized and special cachet is what I started really researching. And that researching those events actually led to the development and construction of my single frame exhibit. So I'd like to go ahead and just point out some of the highlights. I'm not going to go page by page through the exhibit at all. I just want to point out some of the highlights of it. My title page included a background, and for information, the Navy had ordered 60 PBY-1 Catalina flying boats from Consolidated Aircraft Corporation about June 29th, 1935. Consolidated actually moved its construction facility from New York, Buffalo, New York, to Lindbergh Field in San Diego, California. They moved there so they could actually have year-round flying operations take place, both test flights and demonstration flights, which obviously they couldn't do in Buffalo, New York in the wintertime with flying boats. So the Navy postulated and started communicating to the public mid-year 1936 that they were planning a mass flight of PBY-1s from there in San Diego directly to Pearl Harbor territory of Hawaii. And that mass flight was actually conducted in January of 1937. This cover, what I found in the American Airmail Catalog 5th edition in their transoceanic section, turned out to be what they called one of 10 carried on 2 different transoceanic flights that they've documented there. And we'll get to that a little bit as we go through this. The Navy had started mass flights in 1934 to Hawaii. In 1934, they conducted a mass flight of 6 aircraft, not directly from San Diego. They had to fly up to San Francisco first, and then from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They didn't have the capacity to cover the distance. Those aircraft didn't have the capacity to cover the distance from San Diego directly to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This cover was flown on that mass flight, and it is signed by the pilot, Lieutenant T.D. Gwynn. He was a pilot and navigator of aircraft 10P4. The 10 indicates the squadron number for the patrol squadron. So it was VP-10F was the squadron. The P indicates that it was a patrol aircraft, and then the 4 indicates that it was the 4th aircraft in the squadron. A normal squadron consisted of 12, a normal patrol squadron consisted of 12 patrol aircraft. But this particular mass flight only involved 6 aircraft. So the replacement aircraft being provided took the squadron to half strength. What's interesting about this is 2 things. Flying boats are hard to get off the water. You know, physics works. Surface tension is something that tries to hold a flying boat on the water. And these 6 aircraft, in fact, had a difficult time getting off the water. Gwynn's aircraft was the first one off the water of the 6, went airborne about 12:04 p.m. And it took almost another 2 hours for the remaining 5 aircraft to get off the water. Navy surface ships actually had to be run on San Francisco Bay there to provide some agitation in the surface water to give the remaining 5 flying boats a boost to get them off the water. The pilots formed up in formation once all 6 were airborne, and then actually left San Francisco Bay area around 2:20, 2:25 p.m. Now, they had originally planned on leaving around 2 p.m. That was their projected departure time. This cover is interesting because if you note, it has a San Francisco January 10th, 2 p.m. cancellation on it. Well, it couldn't have been canceled at that time because Gwynn was airborne and had been airborne for almost 2 hours at that time. Most of these flown covers either have an 8 a.m. or just an a.m. timestamp in the cancellation on them. I suspect that Gwynn may have requested the 2 p.m. cancellation because that was in fact the projected departure time for the mass flight. The other thing I want to point out from a historical perspective that's interesting, and this appears in the top right hand of the number 10 envelope that's on the title page. It indicates that 6 Patrol Squadron 6 crews were carried en route from Fleet Air Base, Pearl Harbor, to Naval Air Station, San Diego, California, on the USS New Mexico, August 17th, 1936. The Navy had originally intended this mass flight to only involve 6 aircraft and to be conducted in December of 1936. But construction and delivery schedule of the PBY-1s coming from Consolidated Aircraft were accelerated enough that it resulted in the Navy delaying the mass flight until January of 1937. So a full squadron complement of 12 PBY-1s could be flown in the mass flight to Pearl Harbor for Patrol Squadron 6. This decision didn't take place until late in the year. It was November before the Navy started talking to the public about the mass flight involving 12 aircraft. And at that time, the Navy indicated they didn't know if the mass flight would consist of 12 aircraft or if it would consist of two different flights of 6 aircraft each. That decision wasn't made until January 11th, or wasn't publicized, I should say, until January 11th of 1937. To kind of compensate the original 6 crews that came from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, for the projected December 1936 or 36 mass flight, the Navy conducted what they called the first 24-hour mass test flight or mass flight. And this was an endurance flight to prove both the aircraft and the crews were capable of flying for up to 24 hours or even longer. So in December 18th and 19th, the 6 crews flew 6 aircraft that had been delivered and assembled, checked out, and test flown in a 24-hour mass flight off the US Pacific coast. They flew out about 400 miles out over the Pacific from San Diego, and then just rotated north and south for 24 hours or 20 hours, and then came back in because the transit time going 400 miles out was almost 4 hours. So this is one cover that was flown on that. It's interesting to note that the AAMC 5th edition notes for this mass flight that the first 24-hour mass test flight was made consisting of 12 aircraft. Well, this is incorrect, and I show that from 2 perspectives. The first just being the obvious, the corner card or cachet on the flown cover itself. It indicates the plane numbers, and there were only 6 plane numbers that were flown for this event. The other is when you research the actual Navy records in the Navy archive for PBY-1 delivery dates, I found that the 7th PBY-1 was not delivered to the Navy until December 12th. So there wasn't time for the Navy crew to check out this aircraft prior to the December 18th 24-hour mass flight. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to note from a philatelic perspective is on January 11th, the Navy publicized that they projected the mass flight would take place around January 20th. As the schedule firmed up, the squadron really planned on departing on January 27th. Well, the weather was bad that morning, so there was no way they were going to take a chance and start out with bad weather on the route. So they actually departed on January 28th. Well, flight covers had already been prepared for this event. Several had already been prepared for this event. So you can find flown covers that actually have San Diego, California, Air Base Force, San Diego, California cancellations dated both January 27th like this back cover has, and January 28th, like this front cover has. One thing referred to for the January 1937 mass flight in the AAMC catalog is that two colors of ink were used on the squadron hand stamp cachet that was applied to the flown covers. But the catalog doesn't identify what the two colors were. All the covers that you've seen in my presentation so far had this purple, I won't call it magenta, but a purple ink hand stamp cachet applied to them. Well, I have found one cover, and it's the only cover I have seen since 2012, when I became aware of these, that had a hand stamp with the what is the second color of ink used. And you can see here that it's actually a black ink that was used. And here I just emphasize that by putting the two in close proximity so you can see the difference in the colorations in the inks. Now I asked you to note that circled number 3, and I've reproduced it here, from the original cover that I had acquired related to this event. I did find a second example of this cover on eBay years after 2012. And, you know, I wasn't really interested in thinking about purchasing it, nor consider using it, except I noted, and if you'll note with me, here in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a circled number 18 down here. Well, the AAMC catalog indicates that on the flight in January, there were approximately 300 covers carried, 10 of which had also been carried on the 24-hour preparation flight. Well, that is documented with this cancellation in the upper left of the cover, and was documented in the cancellation in the upper left of the first number 10 cover I showed you from my title page. This number, circled number 18, tells me that this can't be correct. It indicates there were at least 18 multi-event covers carried on both the December 1936 and January 1937 mass flights. Again, this is the second instance that I found through research related to this exhibit that that contradicts information presented in the AAMC. And that's really the highlights that I wanted to point out. Now, there's much more information on the pages of my exhibit itself, some good historical stuff that I didn't go into here, but timing wise, I thought this was the right elements to hit. And Lisa, I wanted to ask, are we going to address questions now or at the final end? I couldn't hear you. You're muted there. Oh, I've got to get out, don't I?
Okay, we'll address the questions for Joe at this point over his presentation, and then we'll go to Kurt. So,
Joe,
anybody have questions?
Oh, yeah, Liam has a question. Joe, I find it fascinating, you know, those circles, the numbers, the 3 and the 18. I'm sure once you begin to see the similarities that you were fascinated by those numbers. It's sort of the same kind of phenomena that I find on, you know, hand-painted Hoban covers. But what I find very interesting on these two covers is, you know, the one stamp, the purple stamp, has a single plate number, and it's this, you know, it's the both of the covers. So we wonder, do all 18, if there are only 18, if they have that single stamp with the plate number as well, you know?
I believe they do, Liam.
Yeah.
You'll note that there's a name, and I presented in the exhibit, but I didn't present it here in my presentation. There's a common name associated with about 95% of the mass flight flown covers that I've seen. And that name is the name of a chief radioman that flew on the PBY-1s and flew on both the 24-hour December mass flight and flew on the San Diego to Pearl Harbor mass flight.
Okay.
So I believe he was instrumental in preparing and processing about 90–95% of the flown covers associated with the event. So yes, he prepared covers using similar franking, and very seldom you see franking used other than the common 3 cents.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Any more questions for Kurt?
I
For
have
Joe,
one. I have one, Lisa.
Okay, Lucian.
You made reference to Navy records for some of the information you got.
Yes.
How did you access the Navy records, and how did you find what you were looking for in the Navy records?
Well, what I had to do, Lucian, is actually through the naval archives that are available using internet access, I had to determine what the aircraft fuselage numbers were, or frame numbers were, that Bureau of Ships assigned to them in their construction. And once I had that, I could actually find the entries in the Naval Archives of when the aircraft were delivered and what the final disposition of the aircraft were. Several of these didn't make it through World War II, but several of them did, and they were subsequently surplus by the Navy. But that's how I was able to access it, through internet. But I did have to know what the fuselage frame numbers were that were assigned by Bureau of Ships for these.
That leads to the next question: is how did you get to those frame numbers?
I came across a reference, and it might have been a Consolidated Aircraft publication that I came across reference to, that told me what the aircraft frame numbers were. But I don't recollect what it was for sure right off the top of my head. I couldn't cite to it right now.
Okay, well, thank you, because that's a great amount of scholarly work.
Yeah. Yeah, and more to come.
All right. Thank you, Joe Boyce. We really appreciate your presentation. And with that, Kurt Streepy, we'd like to start your presentation of the 1924 Panama Arms issue for the Isthmus of Panama. And Mr. Streepy's exhibit on this topic, you earned a Vermeer Award at PIPEX, and it is viewable on the PIPEX website. And this is also being recorded so that you can access this on YouTube at a later date. This presentation explores the development and use of 1924 Panama Arms issue within the Isthmus of Panama. The focus will be on a short usage of the Canal Zone overprint and the use of the basic Panama issue with the Canal Zone. This will include material from the American Banknote Archives, postal history, and unissued stamps. So at this, I'd like to welcome Mr. Kurt Streepy and his presentation.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for allowing me to present. We do appreciate it. I'm coming to you from Bloomington, Indiana, so not out there in the West with you guys, but appreciate this opportunity. Over the course of the pandemic, I started collecting organization memberships about as much as stamps, but kind of related to what I'm working on here with this exhibit, kind of a new member of the Columbia Panama Philatelic Association, and then I had been a member of the Canal Zone Study Group for a while, and the U.S. Possession Philatelic Society as well. I'm not going to go through each slide piece by piece, but certainly want to start with the purpose and the scope. You know, the full exhibit's posted on the PIPEX website if you want to see everything, but I will go through some highlights and also a few items that I've discovered since I submitted this one. So they'll have some changes to my exhibit coming up for the APS show. But my purpose was to look at the development of the 1924 Panama Arms issue. Panama started working on this issue in very early 1923. They realized that they weren't going to have enough stock of stamps to support themselves and to support the Canal Zone. Back in 1904, when Panama separated from Colombia with a little help from the USS Nashville that just happened to be in the neighborhood, we worked on a deal there to carve out a section of Panama to build a canal. The U.S. took over the management of that area, and like anyone else, you want to show your sovereignty, you issue stamps. So in 1904, they were overprints on Panama stamps because that was the closest thing they could grab, and put a hand stamp on there. And then there was shortly after that, a period of time where we sent some Bureau of Printing and Engraving stamps on their U.S. stamps in the Canal Zone. That caused some concerns and issues there in Panama because all of a sudden you could walk across the street and you could mail a letter in 1904 from the Canal Zone for cheaper than you could mailing it within Panama. So what resulted in 1904 was the Taft Act. William Taft, who was Secretary of War at the time, went to Panama to kind of settle things down between the U.S. and Panama. Stamps weren't the only issue. There were also issues with tariffs and other things coming in, products coming into the Canal Zone that could be purchased cheaper than they would in Panama. But one of the requirements was that the Canal Zone would purchase stamps from Panama and pay 40% of face value, and then we would overprint them Canal Zone. So basically we were helping support the fledgling new nation and their postal service by paying that. And it also, at that point, even if somebody went across the street and used the Canal Zone post office, Panama was still getting their piece of it without any expense to them, really. So 1923, they were looking for a new issue of stamps. So they developed a coat of arms issue. So we're going to look at how they developed that issue a little bit and look at the pre-production stuff and then go into some postal history. It's a one frame, so I really couldn't cover everything. So I stuck to the use of the issue within the Canal Zone, both being used by the Canal Zone and by Panama. So this was my exhibit, I'm using 17 by 11 pages. So basically it's 2 pages of the exhibit in one. Some oversized pages. This was my title page and basically, bleeds into the beginning of the presentation. They ordered these, a design to be developed in early 1923. And by May, they were, looking at designs by American Banknote Company and another printer. They provided these, finally got some die proofs down to prepared in really fall of 2023. And Panama was pretty desperate to get the stamps printed because they knew the canal zone was almost out of issues. And they were afraid that if they couldn't provide stamps for the overprints, that the canal zone would order them from Bureau of Engraving again, and Panama cut out. By this time in 1920, in late 23, early 24, Panama was already kind of under the understanding that TAFT Act was probably going to go away. So desperately, particularly the 2-cent stamp, to be issued as soon as possible. The 2-cent was the letter rate. You could, the canal zone postal rate was the same as the U.S. postal rate. So in 23, 24, it was a 2 cents to send a letter from the canal zone to anywhere in the U.S., any U.S. territory. It was 1 cent to send a postcard to those areas as well. And Panama mirrored those same postal rates. So the local rate in Panama was 2 cents and 1 cent for a postcard, 2 cents for a international postcard. But they had ordered a set of, oh, sorry to go back here. So they actually made the die proof. They made the die for the 2 cent first, 1477, and actually used that one to copy to make the other 9 denominations based on that one, which all they did was change the denomination and the rate down there, or the spelled version of it down there at the bottom. At this time, the CEMO was equal to a cent, so they were basically, these may have been 2 cent stamps, regardless of whether you're in Panama or you were in the canal zone. But Panama ordered a set of 10. They wanted rates going from a half a cent all the way up to 1 Balboa or $1. These are some examples of proofs that were from the American Banknote Archive, printed on hard paper, cardstock type material to give a good example of what the die looked like. They were printed in sheets of 200 with 2 panes of 100. So over here on the right, this is an example of where the sheet was would have been cut here to make 2 panes of 100. So this is kind of like a gutter to show you that they were larger panes from a sheet. They also printed 1 value on actual gum stamp paper, give the example of what a gum stamp would look like. And those are imperf, and they are been punched to show that they are a specimen. In these, there were, in the archive, there were 200 stamps for most of the denominations, except the 1s and the 2s. There were actually 400 stamps, so there are two full sheets of those. So Panama, they placed their order, and they also placed an order for the canal zone at the same time. So the first order was placed in October of 1923. It was order 7427. And this issue, from the perspective of Panama, was really a workhorse issue for them. They bought reprints of this all the way up to 1905. So a good 22 years worth of printing of this stamp for Panama. And they overprinted it a number of times with different, whether it be some airmails or some charity stamps that they had done, or charity tax stamps they had done. They really became a workhorse for them. Now they issued them in, it's listed as May, but the earliest known issues of some of the stamps, or earliest known uses, is in April 21st. So really end of April, early May is when they started hitting the post office within Panama. There are a few specimens that have been out to different philatelic exhibits and over the years. There's a couple of examples of them. I just have a corner piece of this sheet that actually is a much larger piece of a presentation packet that would have been given to the dignitaries that went to the Pan American Postal Conference in 1931. This Pan American Postal Conference and Postal Union is one of the things that eventually led to the end of the Taft Act, is because at that time, all of the while the UPU was around and everybody set their rates based on the UPU, there was also a Pan American Conference too, that the majority of the Central American, the U.S. and Spain had a separate conference that actually set their postal rates at the local rates. So that put the Panama and the Panama Canal zone all on the same postal rates. So there was really no longer any kind of benefit to go back or forth to the post office, because now they were all the rates were the same. So, so the use in Panama, part I'll point out here is the proximity of some of the cities within Panama and the canal zone. As I mentioned before, you can walk across the street and you can be in a different country. Basically, you go from the U.S. territory of the canal zone over to Panama by crossing the street. So here's an example. This will zoom in where Colón is, and that was one of the major cities of Panama. And then all the orange, inside the orange is the canal zone. So basically, Colón is a little peninsula all surrounded by the canal zone. So you could go from Colón to Cristobal by crossing the street. So here's some examples of some postcards that were posted at the wrong post office. The first one here at the top, there's a Cristobal postmark on the bottom. They ran it upside down through the machine. Possibly because they knew this stamp was a Panama stamp and they really weren't going to cancel it. So then the next day it gets canceled at the Colón post office and processed. And this one was going to Switzerland. So the canal zone probably didn't want to be responsible for going ahead and throwing it in the shipping it to Switzerland, since they weren't getting paid. Now this second one here, again, this one has a Cristobal canal zone postmark. But it's got the Panama stamp on there, but they went ahead and just ran it through the post office and in the canal zone, but it was going to the U.S., so it was probably just as easy to throw it into the bag of mail going to the U.S. versus throwing it in the bag of the mail that needed to go across the street to the Colón post office. Some examples of the Panama issue, a couple of the higher value ones, the 5s and the 10s. In 1925, the register rate was 5 cents. So the 5 cent value paid that registration rate pretty easily. And then this one was going, just from Panama over into the canal zone into Balboa. And then by 32, they had increased the registration rate to 10 cents. So here's a couple of 10-cent stamps on this one. Again, just coming from Panama City to Cristobal. So that would be going clear across the canal, Panama City being on the Pacific side and Cristobal on the Atlantic side. So now, once you get to the canal zone issues, when the canal zone placed their order, they ordered the whole run for them, except the half-cent. They decided they didn't need a half-cent stamp, so they went through the 1 through 1 Balboa. They were the same order number as the original canal zone, I'm sorry, original Panama order here, the 7427 is here at the top, and that's the foreign office for American Banknote Company. That's just keeping track of their orders. So this was a specimen block. Again, these were purchased when the American Banknote Company sold their archives. A lot of the canal zone material, a group of canal zone collectors got together, purchased the large lot that had all these sheets of specimens, and then they broke it up kind of between themselves into their portions. So this is an example of a top right margin where it's got the order number. It's got, you know, return to records and specimen department, because this would have been part of the canal zones group. So there, for the most part, there was only a 3 panes of 100 of most of these. So at most, there's possibly 3 of these out there that have the 10-cent one with the top, but it just kind of depends on what orientation they were within the set. There weren't any huge variations in the overprints, and most likely because they were done at the American Banknote Company. They weren't done locally as some of the other canal zone overprints were done. If you look at canal zone, the banknote issues prior to this, you know, you see a lot of errors, you know, particularly the early years where they were the overprint was, you know, flipped the wrong way. It was reading up instead of down, or down instead of up, you know, and then the base Panama stamps had inverted centers and things like that. So there's a lot of variations in some of those issues. This one, the only, and it doesn't even make it as a Scott listed variation. It's a canal zone study group kind of variation where one of the E's is dropped just a smidge below the line of the other stamps. So that's referred to as the drop E version. And about 10% of the stamps have that dropped section. So those are out there and somewhat common since it's 10% of the stamps. So again, these are actual issued stamps with the order number up here in the corner. I guess I wouldn't call it a plate block, I guess, because it's not really the plate, but it's the order number that's up in the corner of the 1 cent green and the 2 cent red. So these were the ones that the canal zone was most desperate to get. They particularly needed the 2 cent. So the thought is they arrived in January or February into the canal zone. So I've had the opportunity since I put this together to do some additional research, and one of the other canal zone collectors has the actual archives for the American Banknote Company, the documents, the telegrams, the letters, everything, all the communication that went back and forth between the American Banknote Company and their agent in Panama. So I've had the opportunity to read the 1923 versions of these, and waiting to get the 1924 to get the rest of the story. But they had sent the 2 cent red was a rush, and they had put them on a ship by themselves in December of 1923. But I've not yet got the confirmation of whether they landed it there in December or if it didn't, or if it waited till January. So I'm sure there'll be a letter in the next section of archives. Once I get to read those, they'll probably let me know when those actually arrived in the canal zone. So I look forward to hopefully getting that and working with a few other people from Canal Zone Study Group to put together a paper on that at some point in time. But here's a couple examples of the postally used, and this has been really the killer for my exhibit, is getting these items on cover. I mean, these 2 stamps used are, you know, relatively common for a canal zone stamp, but getting them on cover has been a real struggle. So here's a couple. A 2 cent local cover going from Balboa to Cristobal. So again, that's going from one end of the canal to the other, but a 2-cent local, a 1-cent postcard rate, and that goes from the canal zone to the U.S. Covers that rate. Now, one of the other things I did discover here in the interim, since I started my exhibit, or since I submitted my exhibit to PIPEX, is I found two earliest known use of the 2-cent red. It had been listed as February 12th, and I found a February the 11th in an eBay auction. The person had a large stock of Navy covers, and that just happened to be one of the Navy covers, and was able to get my hands on that one, and that's now in my exhibit. So that is a nice add-on to my list. Getting back to that Taft Act, as I mentioned, there was already rumblings in 1923 whenever they were placing these orders. Panama was already making comments that they were didn't want to order too much for the canal zone because they weren't sure how long they were going to keep using stamps, and there were some questions there, but they did go ahead and order them a whole, nine of the issues. And 2 of them got issued. The 1-cent red, 1-cent green and 2-cent red were issued, as I mentioned, early in the year, most likely in February sometime. But these higher denominations, they had plenty of backstock already, so they never made it out of the supply depot there in the canal zone. But then come July 1 of 1924, dissolved Taft. The U.S. no longer had to buy stamps from Panama. They stopped selling the stamps July 1 and had replaced them with overprinted U.S. stamps. But they did give a grace period of a couple months to allow people to use any stock they had. But after August 31st of 1924, the stamps were not to be used anymore. So that really gave a period of time from about mid-February, early February to end of August that these stamps were valid for postage. So that kind of leads to part of the reason it's hard to find a cover, because there's a short window of time. Now, the whole set, and this that I have in my collection, and it's really what prompted me to start looking at this and researching this and lead to an exhibit, is if this 5-cent through $1 were never issued, why do I have a set of them? So back in February of 1924, Panama said, well, we need 600 sets of your new issue to send to the Universal Postal Union. At that time, each issue country had to send stamps to the UPU, and then the UPU divided them up and sent them to each issue or each member country. That way they knew what stamps looked like from particular countries. Well, at that point in time, the requirement was to send 480 sets to the UPU. So someone requested 600 and not quite sure why that's the case yet. Hopefully that'll come up in some research here. But shortly after they sent those 600, complete sets of this stamp started showing up in Panama and England and France. So, just being a guess, somebody filtered those extra 120 sets off and sold them to a stamp dealer, and they dispersed them to to some other dealers. And next thing you know, a little less than 100 years later, I've got one of them in my collection. So there was some that made the philatelic market. They also issued printed some booklet panes for Panama. Again, they used the 1-cent and the 2-cent. This was order number 7428. It was different because the panes were different. They were cut into sheets that could be sliced into to 2 panes of 6. So those were printed, and some specimens are available, but they were all destroyed after the Taft Act was abolished. along with the stock of these higher value ones. So, anyone interested in the Canal Zone or Panama, I certainly, Canal Zone Study Group and Copafil and then the US PPS are all great references. They all got good websites here with some information on them. And they've been very, very helpful in this research project that I've had. And the members there, many of them exhibit and have been great, great help. I'll also put a quick plug in that I do have a stamp chat coming up with APS, going over the Taft Act, going over this back and forth between Panama and US stamps that's coming up here in June, about a month away. So you can register for that on the APS site. I'm pretty sure it's free, even if you're not a member. I get into a little bit more of this back and forth between the stamps of, at first we were overprinting stamps that were Colombian stamps that Panama overprinted, and then we overprinted them again for Canal Zone, and back and forth again. So that'll be available. It'll also be on YouTube. And then I also have a couple of chats out there on Hawaii and first issues that I did with APS that you can find on YouTube. All right. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Kurt. Anybody have any questions for Kurt?
Kurt, I just have one question. I know that the challenge is finding them on cover. Why do you think that's so difficult, finding them on cover?
And in the time I presented this, or I put this together, I've come across 4 more covers, including that first one. And honestly, I think in the early 20s, when this was out, or mid 20s, that year that it was out, at that point in time, covers weren't all that important. People cut, ripped the corners off and got the stamp, and they weren't saving things. Because I find a lot of 1924 picture postcards from the Canal Zone that are in that time range, but you can tell someone's just peeled the stamp off with their hand, and you're thinking, oh, that could have been, one of those. But so I think part of it's people just didn't keep envelopes, during that little window of time. There were a lot of stamp collectors, building at that time, but I don't think they were keeping envelopes as much.
Any more questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Joe, for your wonderful presentations. They're very informative. And I appreciate everybody who attended the last 3 days to our PIPEX show, virtual, and hopefully in next year we will all get to meet in person. So if nobody else has any comments or questions, we will call it an evening. And thank you very much, Kurt.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you,
you very
Joe.
much. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.